Great. So we have with us today Dr. James Dunlea. James is a behavioral scientist at Walgreens, and James works with a cross-functional team of researchers to better understand the psychological, relational, and societal drivers of patients' health-related decisions. In doing so, James provides key insights into how Walgreens can work towards advancing the health and well-being of every community in the United States, which sounds super exciting. Prior to beginning at Walgreens, James earned his PhD in psychology from Columbia, his MA in law from Northwestern University, and his BS in human development from Cornell University. So quite the pedigree we have with James here. And he currently lives in Chicago, has recently returned from France, if I remember correctly, and is hunkering down in Chicago with his partner, Nick. So with that, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to chat and answer some questions you'll have.
Awesome. Well, before we kind of get started into thinking a little bit and learning about kind of what it is that you do at Walgreens, I want to spend some time talking about your research because while your pedigree is very, very fascinating and prestigious, I think it offers a really interesting component, particularly in the justice or in the legal space. So we know that, or the way that I've kind of seen your research is kind of at this like intersection of like punishment and like cognitive decision-making and kind of a bit of equity, right? Does that feel like the right intersection of sorts? I feel like I kind of made that intersection up, but that might or might not be it. So can you talk to us a little bit about that intersection, kind of how you came to that research and kind of what that research looks like in practice?
Yeah, sure. So one kind of other layer onto, the intersection you talked about was I'm trained as a developmental psychologist. So really kind of the thing that I studied was how our thoughts and our intuitions about the legal system change throughout the course of our development or not, and what are kind of the processes that might, shift our cognition one way or another. I started to do research in the area a long time ago. When I was an undergraduate starting out, I randomly joined a lab, and it was on how it was kind of looking at children's testimony in courtroom settings.
Sure.
And there was a lot of research on, in this space about how adult decision makers kind of evaluate and think about children as maybe arbiters of truth or as people who are engaging in the legal system. And, I was fast in this area, but I was so kind of perplexed at the idea that this focus on how people are viewing children's involvement in the legal system was so like from adult to child, and there wasn't this kind of bidirectional, like, what do children think about the legal system? What do children think about all of this stuff? Mm-hmm. Children are not passive agents, they're actively engaging in the world around them, right? Mm-hmm. And it turned out there wasn't a whole lot on how children are understanding legal processes or the world around them, despite the fact that, one day they are going to be tasked with being active agents in the legal system. And, that might, not even start that much later in life. There's a lot of children, right, as we know, that are actively engaged in the legal system as people who are testifying, as people who witness crimes, and people who have, parents who are incarcerated. So I thought that, I might as well do some work on, how children are making sense of this, complex world that they're navigating.
That's awesome. I feel like I hadn't considered that until right now. You're right that they are certainly navigating through the world and thinking about all of the ways that children are already involved in the system. I don't know why that hadn't occurred to me until this moment. So I certainly appreciate kind of that as kind of the base of the work that you were doing. And so then from there, it kind of seems like it's maybe spiraled, right, into like how people navigate the legal system. How do they receive it? How do they make sense of it? And then how do they make decisions about it? So right. Kind of before we kind of get into where you are today, can you kind of just talk us through kind of how your research has kind of built on each other to kind of get you to kind of maybe your dissertation work or kind of the last work that you did before joining Walgreens?
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly the leap between doing my doctoral work and what I'm doing here at Walgreens is quite large of a leap, but I can kind of delineate the scaffolding during my graduate years and even from, earlier on in my career. So, I ended my undergraduate with, the question of what are factors that shape our reasoning about the law and legal processes. And that was obviously not a very super tightly scoped topic. But I was like, okay, I think that, development might have something to do with it. And I'm also interested in other contextual factors, such as knowing incarcerated people, such things like that. But I realized that, I was asking these kind of like broad questions about, what do people think about punishment in the law and stuff like that without actually knowing that much about law itself. Like I was trained as a, developmental psychologist in undergrad, and then I was, asking these questions about the law, but I didn't know what the law was saying in the first place. And so I took a brief kind of hiatus of doing a lot of research, and I did a master's degree in law to actually learn about what the law says. And it really kind of was not a program for people like me, but it was most people who wanted to transition into a legal space of some sort. But I used it as more of an information gathering time period to better understand what the law is saying. So for me, I use this as kind of a pathway forward to understand, what are some more tightly knit questions I can be asking about the development of social and moral cognition in this space. I got to graduate school. I, found one PI who was interested in, she actually had not really been doing work in this space. She was trained in religious cognition, the development of religious cognition. And so I was so shocked that she interviewed me, but she did, and we started to work together. And I started to ask these questions about what kids thought about certain types of punishment, et cetera. I specifically focused on incarceration in graduate school. Incarceration is a really common form of punishment in the world. I'm preaching to the choir here, but 50% of people in the United States have a family member who are incarcerated. That number looks differently based upon the extent to which you're minoritized on the basis of race or ethnicity. And so despite the fact that it's really a common social experience, we don't study it. We don't study this from a psychological perspective of what people think about it. And so I started to ask a lot of questions about what people think about punishment and punished individuals, the inferences that they make. Again, not surprisingly, people draw really negative inferences about people who are implicated in the legal system. And my research kind of pivoted there to understanding, chronicling the development of this negativity, to understanding interventions that we can take to kind of curtail this negativity. So I did a lot of work kind of iterating about, what sorts of, brief psychological interventions can we use in the form of just delivering different types of messages about the way we speak about incarceration and punishment to kind of derail this negativity. And so that's kind of the way, I kind of navigated graduate school. But the kind of core part of, what, drove my interest every day was, how do I work toward, making the world a little bit of a better place? And of course, I think that's why a lot of us go into psychology, right? We see something in the world and we want to, maybe help fix it. And maybe that's a naive approach, but I thought that's what made me love, doing what I do. And so to touch on the latter part of your question, I was looking for, academic or non-academic jobs at, a certain point in graduate school. And I really, if I could, wanted to retain some of that, like, how do I, promote like egalitarian outcomes using psychology, behavioral science, cognitive science. And so, I was more expansive than that in my scope, but I was very happy to find a position that, maybe the research can be used in that way.
Totally. And as you were describing kind of this this story, this kind of like non-linear kind of rabbit hole of sorts that you're kind of going down to think of this. I can totally see the parallels then to the work that you're doing at Walgreens. But before we get there, you kind of brought this up of you were ultimately looking for AltAc industry jobs as one of the primary places that you wanted to land. So can you talk us through a little bit about kind of what led you to that decision of wanting to look in AltAc industry versus staying in academe, and kind of what factors did you consider kind of in that choice to ultimately go one way versus the other?
Yeah, super transparently, I wasn't one of those people who like was in grad school and hated it. I loved graduate school. I loved the space I was working in. I have a lot of privileges that allow me to love being a graduate student, and doing well in the academy. But at the end of the day, I don't like not having control over my life, and so I in addition to being a researcher, I have a partner and a family, and my partner got a job as a doctor in Chicago, and figured 10 years into our relationship is not the time to be starting long distance and doing all these crazy career balancing. So I looked for postdocs in Chicago. I did not get any postdocs in Chicago. But even before that, I was pretty set on kind of wanting a bit more stability and control in my life. And so probably a year out of finishing graduate school, I started to really consider looking for non-academic positions. And so, the biggest factor was honestly having control over my life. The second, again, just transparently, is I wanted to be paid a salary that allowed me to just not worry about that part of my life as much. And, again, I touched upon this. I always wanted my research to be translational and impactful in that sense. And I think that when I started graduate school, I didn't have a realistic expectation of what research, what it was doing in the academy. And certainly the area that I was working in was much more focused on kind of theoretical implications as opposed to translational. And I wasn't seeing my research being scaled or being put out in the world. And, eventually that it was always like in the back of my mind that eventually I was like, what am I doing? So it was a conglomeration of those factors that kind of just came to a head. And I was like, I just think it doesn't make sense for me to continue going into, the academy at this point. So that was kind of my thought process there.
I appreciate that honesty and that transparency. And I feel like, I think for some of us that have moved into these spaces, we feel I can relate on numerous of those factors of wanting to be in this space. But one thing that I think that you said, which is really thoughtful, and we talk about it generally in this series, but I want to elevate it here because you've mentioned it, is the idea that your partner got a job someplace. And so you were kind of following your partner to that place and would be interested in staying in academe if it were place-based, let's say in Chicago, for your example, but that if it wasn't Chicago, it wasn't the time in your relationship and your family's, trajectory to make a decision and to pivot someplace else. I think that challenge, that particularly for folks that are partnered, that challenge of making decisions about going places that are more prestigious or more academic or where you're going to be at an R1 are pushed or prioritized over the concept of building your family, staying with your family, creating a loving family, that those two things sometimes are in tension with one another in academia. And there's, at times there's a perception that students kind of have to pick one over the other. And kind of what advice would you give for students that are kind of having to navigate these tensions? And I don't even just mean partner tensions. It could be family tensions. It could be wanting to be in a location that's safe for the LGBTQ community, that's safe as a single person, right?
Yeah.
Who's going to be able to be dating, what would you say to students who are kind of navigating these tensions about, how do you go about navigating that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to give a very eloquent or thought out response to this, but I mean, you, it's a very personal decision, right? Like for me, at the end of the day, the thing that I prioritized most in my life was my relationship with my partner and my family, and I just knew that that's the thing that is going to keep me warm at night, metaphorically, right? And it's not my postdoc that I got in Connecticut. It's being with my partner, and so I just think that you have to do what works for you, and you're going to get a lot of information and advice, whether it's solicited or unsolicited, from other people about what is best for you in your career. And I can tell you that pretty much nobody told me that the best thing for me was to not do a postdoc or a faculty position and, move into this, this new space, but beat it with my partner. No one told me that that was the right option, but now that I've made that option or that decision, I can tell you that it is very much the right decision for me.
That's awesome. I appreciate that. Okay, so we know that, you ultimately make this decision. It sounds like you kind of put feelers out there in different spaces, not necessarily just in Walgreens, but for, I would consider kind of Walgreens corporate space. So were you also looking at other spaces like nonprofits or that are research-based or advocacy-based or in tech? Were you looking at different spaces or all kind of more narrow in scope to like corporate spaces?
I was very open to the space that I worked in. I had a list of attributes that I prioritized, but sure. Just because I was not open to moving elsewhere besides Chicago, I knew that, it's a give and take, and I just had to be open to what was here.
Yep.
So I initially began looking more in like the nonprofit advocacy space because that's the area that I don't know, felt the most, that made the most sense to me.
Yep.
I just didn't find a lot that was there. I mean, I was looking on LinkedIn. I don't know, like just probably wasn't looking at the right types of positions or something. I did actually, though, receive a job offer from a nonprofit organization. And I was like this close to like going there if Walgreens didn't kind of pop up. But, I didn't have a lot of, like, I didn't see a lot of options in that space for me and for what I needed. So I did a lot of information gathering on the different types of kind of research positions that were there that could fit my skill set. And I started by crossing things off the list. Some people build a career in graduate school about who can do the fanciest data modeling and statistics, and that was not me. So I was like, I'm not going to be like a data scientist. And so I wanted, something that was, doing research, but, not like that. By virtue of not knowing a lot about what was out there, I was like, oh, I can go into user experience because that's what a lot of people do after graduate school, and quickly realized that maybe that wasn't like the best for me. Like I didn't have really oppositions toward it necessarily, but I just didn't know a lot about other positions that were out there. And so, I did interviews and I did, receive offers in the user experience space. But then I started to kind of look at what else is there. And as you go along, you realize that, there are things besides just user experience. And so I looked at things in market research. I looked at things in people analytics. And I looked at things finally in behavioral science. That was kind of the last bucket I looked into. But I think that's also kind of the, like, one of the newer areas in industry. And that, the behavioral science area is actually pretty ill-defined across different organizations. And so I think that people have kind of different, views of it. And so long story short is that I considered a lot of different places or like types of positions.
Sure.
And after doing, informational and formal interviews and, pretty much across the board, I could, winnow down exactly kind of what I wanted.
That's awesome. For folks that are kind of in the audience, we post all of the questions that we typically ask our rock stars, both James and other folks, on our website. That's there exactly for that reason. So that way you can take the questions, you can do your own informational interviews, and you're not building those kind of questions from scratch. So then thinking about that, Josh is asking, thinking about kind of the timeline there. When did you first start applying for those postdocs in Chicago? And maybe comparatively, when did you start applying for those kind of nonprofit or user experience or Walgreens space? Where was that in the timeline?
Yeah, the timelines are really different, and I found this out
Sure.
really quickly. So I think that there were no posted postdoc positions that were there that I was really applying to. I was going through the mechanism of, I'm going to apply through a funding mechanism, and if it comes through, sometime it comes through. I made those initial conversations with faculty in the Chicago area, pretty early on. I don't remember exactly, but I think it was probably about the summer before my last year of graduate school. I had those conversations like, hey, here are some research ideas. Would you be interested in pursuing this? At this time, I had pretty much decided that I would go into industry, but I just wanted to have every option addressed and whatever. So I still, looked into the postdoc route. So that was a timeline for looking at postdocs. I didn't really apply for a lot of them afterwards, other than the NSF application I submitted.
Sure.
There was maybe one or two of them that I applied to. There were kind of formulated postdocs later on in the winter and spring. But at that point, it was kind of I knew I wasn't going to take them, but just in case, cross your or dot your I's, cross your T's, whatever.
Yeah.
At the same time, concurrently, when I first started looking at postdocs in the summer before my last year of grad school, I started to apply for industry jobs, which is hysterical, because I started to get interviews early fall, September, October. I got my first job offer in October, and they're like, great, so November 1st start date. And I was like, oh, well, actually, I finished my PhD in April. Will that work? And they're like, no, obviously not. What are you doing applying jobs out early? And I was like, oh, well, typically, I'm used to applying for things a year out. And they're like, yeah, that's not how it works here.
No, it's not. Oh.
It is simply not. Luckily enough, they actually did offer me a job later on in the spring, that same company. But I ended up not taking it. But that was not typically the response that I got. People were just like, no, we're not going to talk to you anymore. So, I used then, after I figured out that's not how you go about things, I used the rest of the fall semester to figure out what types of jobs I wanted.
Yeah.
I did a ton of informational interviews.
Yeah.
It was like having a second job, honestly.
For sure.
And interviewing at places that maybe were my first choice places to work at, but I used it as a lot of practicing of how do I convey, myself as this person coming out of academia, studying something that is very niche, studying something that is not typically what, is seen as a user experience researcher or in people ops. They don't, I'm not the profile of person that they're talking to. And so I did a lot of titrating of how I present myself to different types of positions. Yep. And reframing my skill set based upon types of positions. And I literally had a document where I was writing out different introductions that I could practice for myself to be this is how you'd present yourself as a UX researcher. This is how you present yourself as a behavioral scientist. And once I figured out the way to do that for each type of position, yep, I was like, okay, I can stop interviewing for a little bit because I don't need a job for a while. I started to get job offers and I was like, okay, I know this is working, so I'm gonna hold off. And then I started to seriously apply for jobs that I wanted, actually wanted, I could see myself at. pretty much like right after January 1st. So like
Yep.
that week after, the holiday, I came back and I was like, okay, job time. And that happened. I got my job at Walgreens in February. So after that, after I figured out how to interview, that was a lot smoother of a process. And so you don't have to start so early like I did, but you could practice, beforehand. So
Totally. And I totally appreciate kind of your candor saying, oh man, I didn't do it the way you're supposed to do it, right? I started, the season before.
yeah,
And totally
clearly.
appreciate people are like, no, that's not how this works around here. So there's certainly a learning curve in that way. Can you talk us through, I think it's really interesting how you said that if you're going to go for UX or people ops or behavioral science, or even maybe it's by space, if not, lens, right? That you had to learn to frame your work, yourself, your interests differently. How did you figure out how to frame yourself in each of those spaces? Like, what was your process for that?
Yeah, I mean, this had to be the hardest part, I think, of the job cycle for me, was how do I talk about myself and my skill set and give examples of projects that I've done that make sense for that area.
Yep.
So, initially I would show up to interviews when I wasn't having luck, and I'd be like, hi, I'm a social cognitive developmentalist. I study social and moral cognition and what kids think about punishments. And then they were like, oh, this is like a marketing research firm, you know that, right? And I was like, yeah, like I could do the research, it's fine. And they were like, no, this is not for you. And in reality, like I can definitely do the work, but I wasn't talking to them in a way that made sense to them.
Sure.
And so I took a step back and was like, okay, what is like the core process that these different types of jobs are dealing with? So like, what is the job itself? So like, for example, like, one big thing in market research is, you can do a lot of like concept testing or like message testing to see what messages are most effective in creating a certain outcome that you want.
Sure.
And then I was like, okay, well, I definitely don't like test people's perceptions of products in my grad school research, and I don't work in this space, but like what similar things have I done? And so then I was like, okay, well, in one project I was testing the effectiveness of different messages of how we talk about incarceration to reach an outcome that I want. And that outcome was, increasing, pro-social behavior or decreasing stigma.
Sure.
So I was like, okay, this is the project I'm going to talk about in market research interviews, but I'm going to tell them straight up front, do not pay attention to the context that I'm talking about. I'm telling you about the process that I'm using. What I'm doing in this project is I'm testing the effectiveness of messages. And you do that a lot in your job too, right? And they're like, yep. And I'm like, cool, we do the same thing. And so I would say, I'm studying this in the example context of the legal system. But again, the underlying process, same thing. I'm iterating messages. Once I started to do that, I was having so much more luck in,
Totally.
Because I was able to translate, like, here's the underlying process that you're doing, and I can do that too. By giving them really concrete examples of things that I've done in the past. It's much more compelling to like give them this like tangible example as opposed to being like, oh, I could do that. So I guess I just tried to figure out what is like core to that process and like give an example of how I've done that in the past.
That's awesome. We in this series kind of take the perspective that, especially if you really want to go the distance in terms of really expanding what's available to you, to consider your PhD more of a methods degree or a thinking degree of some kind, and then finding a way to apply kind of what you've done exactly how you have. Okay, what's the process? Cool. I have done a similar process like that over here. What are you trying to develop? I have also developed things over here. Do you think that that's the way to kind of perceive, or for folks to think about themselves as they move into industry spaces, is really thinking of themselves as perhaps methodologists or concept thinkers or generalists, as opposed to like a subject matter expert and, solitary confinement for myself, versus
Right.
understanding like the process of organizational change, or saying I do organizational change work, right? Is there a pro or a con to thinking of yourself that way?
I mean, I think that, there's nothing inherently wrong with thinking yourself as a subject matter expert. Like that doesn't ever go away, right? Like I'm always going to know about the stuff that I know about. And
Yeah.
now I'm actually able to, re-engage with reading about that stuff because I have the time to.
Sure.
But then if you're, if you're presenting yourself like that, then those are the types of jobs that you're going to get. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? If you
Sure.
want a job in that space, show them what you know. But if you're someone like me who was casting a wide net and had to think about, how am I speaking to people who are of, they know nothing about incarceration, they probably don't care about incarceration. How do I like connect with them? Then you can think of it more as like a methodological, background, or just like what is the overlapping skill set that is common to those backgrounds. And so like at my core, I'm still a researcher, and I have those skill sets, and those are applicable to those jobs. And so the approach that I took primarily was that I have this generalist background, and I am happy to apply my skill set to this new area. But now that I'm in my job, I find myself working on projects that actually aren't around punishment, but are somewhat more related to things I've studied in the past, like causal reasoning about structural inequalities or things like that. Like I know that literature, and I'm applying it directly to some projects that I'm working on right now, and that's like really cool. And I'm given the kind of flexibility to do that in my current position. So like you can present yourself like that, and who knows, maybe your subject matter expertise will come back later.
Totally. Well, I feel like that feels like a really good segue to learning more about like what you do at Walgreens. So kind of before we kind of get in the compare and contrast of what's Walgreens like comparatively to, right? Can you talk us a little bit about like what does research day to day look like for you? Like how you walk in or open the computer, maybe in the internet world, and you start your day, kind of what does the day look like or your work week look like?
Yeah, so it's pretty different from my day-to-day as a graduate student. I, at a high level, am working on a lot more projects than I was before.
Mm-hmm.
I am doing a lot more project management of these projects as opposed to being in the weeds of everything necessarily. Um, and pretty much the entire research process is different. And I guess I can start there because I feel like that's the most kind of crucial thing to talk about.
Sure.
So, I guess, of course I'm preaching to the choir here again, but when you're in academic spaces, you are carrying out the research from start to finish, right? Like you come up with the idea, you maybe work with one or two other people to refine it, and you develop the materials, you launch a study, you collect the data, clean the data, analyze the data, write it up, etc. My current position, it feels much more segmented in terms of like how the research process is broken up.
Mm-hmm.
So how a research project will start for me is, so I'm part of a free floating research consulting group in Walgreens. Basically what happens is we have like this organizational kind of flow chart for people who want to do research, who they should contact with like their research questions. So if it's like a social, behavioral, cognitive science type question, they kind of go to my group.
Mm-hmm.
So we field questions that are pretty broad, and we're contacted by both clients within or people within Walgreens who have their own group, but we also are consulted by external partners as well. So that can be places like big pharmaceutical companies, other consulting companies who come to us as experts in like health oriented research.
Sure.
Because the groups that contact us are not always researchers, they come to us with a topic they would like to research, and they say, I want to know about how patients navigate the healthcare process at Walgreens. And we're like, okay, well, that's like a topic. That's not a question. Like what's actually know. And so, we spend time with them to scope a question that is testable, or, just a tighter question that they want to explore. And we make sure, like, hey, is this the thing that is good for you? Is this your business question? Does this answer, your long-term objectives? Once we come to an agreement on that, then they become relatively less involved and they turn over more to my team. So after that, we will put together a relatively, rough draft of a research plan in terms of the methods that we want to use. You can almost think of it as sort of like a pre-registration of like, here's the stuff that we're going to be doing in this study.
Yep.
Look good to you? Okay, cool. Here's the part that really differs from academic research, is that at this point in the process, we will put out a bid to research vendors to actually execute this research. Research vendors are basically companies that have enormous panels of people who will do research. So you can conceptually think of it as something like Prolific or MTurk, but it is more sanitized than those places of people who, like, it's actually more like representative of the US population, stuff like that.
Yeah. We
also know like a lot of information about these people. We can profile them down to like, very granular levels of like details about them. So for example, if we're like, I want a patient who is on metformin for 6 months, we can tell the panel this, and they will get us a sample of people who are on metformin for 6 months. So really granular. Basically, what we use these places for, so they will collect our data for us. They also have like researchers on their team who will have a second look at the research plan. And it's always good to have like an extra pair of eyes there. And they will make recommendations if they feel they need to do so. But they will actually do a lot of the programming of the like surveys. If it's qualitative research, like in-depth interviews or like focus groups, they will actually carry out those for us. I will always like sit in on those sessions because they're all held remotely, but I'm not like asking, like I'm giving them the questions to ask, but they're actually doing it for me. They're scheduling all the participants, etc. So we will give them the specifications of how many people we need, and the data is collected for us within a week or two. So really, really quick turnarounds. Then they will clean. So we always get all the data that we like, the raw data and stuff, but typically when they finish data collection, they will give us a cleaned version of the data, because we'll have conversations about how we like want it to look. We'll get kind of a top line report of initial analyses that they've done for us. So of course, like we're telling them like, hey, like here is the initial kind of pass we want you to take. And then we'll get a report back in the format that we ask for. So if it's a written format, a PowerPoint, etc. And then they'll still send over the cleaned and raw data for me to do additional analyses that I can just do because I'm trained to do that, right? And so I'll add on to the reports that they send with additional stuff that I want to do, or maybe my business partners want me to do. This process again is relatively quick. Projects that I've worked on, are range from maybe a week or two to, one of the longer projects that I've worked on was, now it's like 4 months, it's wrapping up. But that was, a really, really huge project that we've had to do. So most projects I'd say are around a month. There's like 4 weeks-ish, 3-4 weeks. So that is kind of the life cycle of a project. And then I will communicate the findings to our clients. And then if they want to know more information, I'll work with them until, the final report is what they want. And yeah, so you can see it's a pretty different cycle than, an academic kind of project.
I would say so. I mean, I think about some of the grants that I have that have me on 12 months. I just finished a grant proposal this morning, shoving something into an 18-month timeline. And I was like, oh man, this is so fast. So I appreciate, you're like, oh, I could do it in 2 weeks. I'm like, whoa. But there's something to be said there, right? That it feels a little bit, and maybe this is me oversimplifying it, right? That you're effectively a PI on a grant or a PI on a project of somebody else's initial question, but you've designed it. You and your team have designed it, and then you have a collection of research associates all around the country to help do the work, which is why it can happen with such expediency. Is because there's so many more. They have an entire infrastructure. It's like you have small corporations that are effectively working for you to do that work. So it sounds like as people are working in these spaces or looking in these spaces, they could ask questions if they're interested in being more of the business to business end, which is where you sit, right? Which is, what is your question? Let me help you walk through it being an actual research question and then pushing it back to you. Or if you want to be folks that do the data for someplace like Walgreens, you could go instead work for one of these consulting, probably for-profit research firms that basically bid out for Walgreens' work.
Yep, and I have friends who are on my side. I have friends who are on the agent side, and they're very different jobs. But everyone I work with pretty much on the agent side, who is doing like the data analysis or even like the moderation for these studies, are PhDs in psychology, and so it just kind of depends on the space that you want to be in, and there are jobs in both kind of buckets there.
Totally. It sounds like one of the questions kind of folks could ask is like, how close to the data am I day to day? Like, how close am I to the data collection day to day, to try and tease out, is this more of your role or kind of a role that you would hire out? So that kind of answers some of the questions of like, who's your audience in this space compared to academic spaces? To what extent do you have autonomy over the research question? It sounds like you have some space to lead the research question in a certain way, but you necessarily don't start with it. But it does sound like you have autonomy to design it how you want per the research question that you're trying to answer.
That's right. I will say that one kind of way the like research is set up for us is that like we are given like pots of money, like the research teams are given pots of money, and you can think of it as almost like aims in a grant. Like they're very broad aims, and so like the sector that I work on is like kind of like increasing like access and equity to healthcare.
Sure.
And so like those, like the projects that I typically work on are in that like fulfill that aim. And if somebody comes to us and we don't see initially how like their question is relating back to the aim that we're working under, we can work with them to pull it into into scope. And so like there's some sort of like specification of the type of research that we do, like that is a little bit more narrow than just like the social sciences. So just to clarify that part of it as well. But yeah, I think that your characterization is spot on.
Well, that sounds, I mean, I think what I'm hearing from you kind of saying like, I work in a center that these are our aims, is then it allows you to kind of self-select into the day-to-day work and questions you want to ask, right? So if your goal is to ask questions about access and health equity, broadly speaking, right, coming from a place where you wanted to talk about structural inequities that were existing in legal space translated here, it feels like you still have some room to say, I'm not just asking or doing random questions that it is
Mhm.
still within a sandbox of something I'm really passionate about learning more about.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And one nice thing is that although like, so I have the option to take other projects as well. And so
Sure.
um, sometimes I do, not because I'm interested in the question or I think it's like my most passionate project, but
Sure.
just as a way to gain skills in a different type of project. So for example, like I'm working on a very, very user experience focused project right now. And it's literally how patients are like using an app, which, still falls on like a healthcare related app, which
Sure.
falls under like my purview, but I did that to like just diversify my portfolio. And so, I guess I'm bringing this up because, doing research in these like large corporation settings, you do have the option to pursue many different types of projects.
Mhm.
You can kind of add to your repertoire of like things that you know about as you go along.
Totally.
Um, just because, down the road, if something comes up and you have to apply your skills in a different area, like you can, gain knowledge along the way. And so, yeah, that's definitely a part of the job that I'm taking advantage of right now.
That's awesome. And I think that speaks, I think in my personal experience about taking more of a generalist approach to this work, that the more that you consider it as learning skills that get applied in different settings or different ways, the more
Mhm.
marketable I think you are in these spaces. That's not to say that there is not important space for folks that are subject matter experts. Kate does has a very specific subject matter expertise and then gets to apply it directly in a custody setting, right? Which is really cool. But for the rest of us, someone like me, I work in a space where we work across multiple systems. So being able to understand different kind of spaces inside a larger system makes me more marketable and allows me more areas where I could go off and do that work. So it sounds like incorporate research spaces, you have the opportunity to build that skill set to then potentially send you down a rabbit hole of expertise if you found that that was really useful. One of
Right.
the things that I'm hearing though, as you're talking about this, is kind of, it sounds like you do actually have a decent amount of creativity and elbow room to kind of do the work as you want to do it. But how then does Walgreens kind of measure your success? And to what extent then do they also kind of encourage your own scholarship besides
Mhm.
producing a report that goes to your business partner?
Yeah, so I think you're definitely right. I do feel that I am allowed a lot of kind of wiggle room and creativity room. Um, so I was actually pretty opaque on like how I'm how I'm being measured until recently. Um, so it's the end of our fiscal year, and so we had to set our goals for next year. And so basically, I worked with my direct supervisor and our VP to set out like what are the behavioral science goals for Walgreens.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to A, set those, and then B, like explicate how, like, what are some benchmarks that I can be doing to like be reaching those goals.
Sure.
And, for example, like this sounds really minor, but, one of the goals for me this year is to do a lot more research linking, cognition and behavior among our patients. A lot of the times we'll be doing research that is just more attitudinal or cognitive or just behavioral, and they're not, linking the two when in reality we're drawing inferences like across, but they're not, put together in
Sure.
the same paradigm. And so, for me, one of my goals is to launch research programs that do a better job linking cognition and behavior in the same paradigm.
Cool.
And as long as I can show evidence of that, at the end of next fiscal, that's what they're asking for, And
Sure.
so um, they're very kind of self-driven, benchmarks of evaluation. And of course, like I have to like do my job on a day-to-day basis, but
Sure.
like broadly, they're letting me kind of steer the ship of like how I want to be evaluated. And I do like that. And one thing that I really pushed for example, that I cared a lot about in my PhD was focusing on the experiences, for example, of like more minoritized individuals in the healthcare system at Walgreens.
Yep.
And they were like, oh, like we've never really thought about that, which is surprising maybe.
Yeah.
Um, but like that's a goal that like I personally care about, but I'm able to infuse that as like how I'm doing research on my day to day. So
Totally. That's awesome. And I appreciate the ability to kind of set your own success, which feels a little bit like, academe to some extent, right? That you set your own goals, you set how you're measured, and you measure yourself effectively there.
yeah.
So then even thinking about kind of this work of how do we think about folks who are minoritized in Walgreens space? You do work that directly supports that aim and that goal. Is the research that is produced from that idea, which is very clearly yours, do you get to disseminate that widely, like something I could pick off the shelf and read, or is that all considered proprietary and then only has to stay in house?
So the way that Walgreens works is it is proprietary to Walgreens. However, there's a lot of like the results of the work is public facing, obviously, right? So we're taking the work to, roll out, initiatives that will be seen by the public. And so, to the extent that it's private information, I guess like the research is private information. However, like the results of the research, I like to think are public just because we're impacting the lives of, ultimately many years down the road, right? When these initiatives do roll out, they are public facing. So, it's not as, there's still a lot of kind of, red tape around the research
Sure.
in terms of accessibility. However, my understanding is there is more of a push within the organization to have more kind of more public or institutional partnerships in which we are doing kind of more public facing scholarship.
Yeah.
We're not there yet, but that's kind of the current state of it.
And I think that's helpful for folks to understand that research in corporate spaces is a bit more proprietary. So it means that if you're looking to disseminate your personal work, you might have to do nights on your own, nights and weekends kind of on your own to do your own scholarship. But that's when you can kind of lean on your friends and former colleagues in academe settings to say, hey, I'm happy to write with you, I'm happy to do this work with you. I still have data. I have a dissertation that I don't have time to write from, but you're welcome to take the data and I can help write with it. I think that's kind of how you then be able to straddle the line to being able to do corporate work and continue building a scholarship portfolio. Does that sound about right for what your experiences are?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. There are also corporate spaces, and this isn't my experience necessarily. However, like there are colleagues that I have who have corporate research jobs that you do still publish in academic journals. You do it is more public facing, and so those jobs do exist. You're just publishing under like your affiliation is just like your employer, and that's like what you do. But right, so like what you were saying before, for me, I am finishing up, other papers that I have not finished yet from graduate school, but I'm definitely ramping down that now, which it's kind of good. But yeah, I think that a lot of us have kind of, our foot in both doors right now.
I think that makes sense. And certainly, a question folks can ask if they are interested in public facing dissemination. Those are kind of questions. Is this only proprietary or what does this look like?
Right.
So, I guess kind of as I'm thinking about kind of the differences then about this space and being in corporate space, that we've talked about, a bit of the day-to-day might be different, but the metrics of success might be similarly, self-driven, that how you publish might be different, but a question worth asking. We know that the market speed is different. So like you wouldn't necessarily apply for a job 6 months or 8 months out. But thinking about the actual interview process itself, some places, maybe not in corporate America, so I'll be interested to hear about this. Some places require job talks as part of the interview process. And then, so to what extent kind of does that happen in the corporate space or in your experience? And then kind of what's on the table for you to negotiate or is non-negotiable kind of in these talks as you kind of onboard to these spaces?
Yeah. So kind of the nitty gritty of the interviews themselves varied a lot. Some places I gave a more like pseudo job talk,
Sure.
but you're focusing, I'd say, on different things. So, for example, I, interviewed and received an offer from, a tech company where I gave a, job talk. And it was my research on what kids think about incarceration, but as
Sure.
opposed to, making them care about the results, I talked about like the methods that I used and kind of my thoughts about the affordances of these methods, or like why I made choices behind why I did. That's what they were interested in this talk. They weren't interested in my findings
Sure.
necessarily. And so I made sure to explicate to them, what they cared about in that talk. The majority of my interviews, though, some gave me like data files to like analyze, be like, tell us, if this is the data you get, and here's the research question that you have, tell me, what you're finding and like what actionable recommendation you'd make based on what the data are telling you. So for example, like for a nonprofit that I interviewed at, they were like, here's what like community members are saying who use a certain service. And I would like to know, based upon what these data are telling you, it was a mix of qual and quant data, like how should we like change the program, if anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of the type of exercise you would have to do. And in addition to like those like homework type exercises, you
Sure.
obviously just interview, with other individuals. So most places were a mix of individual interviews and then like panel interviews made up of 1 to 3 other people who you had to talk to. So some interviews lasted a week, some were months in terms of like, you were interviewing. If interviews are lasting too long for you and you have other job offers that you're considering, you can tell them that you're considering other job offers, and that will typically light the fire under them, and they'll expedite your process. In terms of things that are on the negotiating table, I negotiate a lot of things at different places. And you can, I think now, especially in the world of like virtual work, where it's much more common, you can ask for a lot. You can think about things like, hey, this job is currently listed in person, is remote on the table? Obviously things that are typically negotiated, such as salary and benefits, like of course. But you can also like at multiple places, I was like, I have a PhD and I don't know, like this is not a requirement for the position. So like, can you give me anything extra because I have a PhD? And they're like, no one said no. So as long as they gave some sort of rationale, like it seemed to be, a decent thing to be talking about.
Sure.
At places I negotiated the extent to which I'd go into the office versus in person or remote, if it was a job that was local to me. And so really things that like vacation days, etc., like stuff like that, like you can negotiate a lot of different things. So I think the worst thing they could say is no.
Yeah. I
So.
appreciate that. Some of the we've talked to some extent about some of the things in industry spaces that looks different. So things like certainly benefits, but being kind of specific. So benefits including the number of days off, right? That being negotiable. Having prearranged days off prior to starting work. So saying I'm going to take that week in September off, and that's not going to count towards my PTO. Maybe percent matching of a 401k. So in some spaces, the matching percentage might be negotiable. Thinking about particularly in fintech or financial tech, shares, the number of shares being negotiable. Is there anything that you think is specific to the corporate space that is negotiable that might not be negotiable in, let's say, nonprofit or anything like that?
I'm not thinking of anything. I think that comparing my experience across specifically the nonprofit space and the corporate space, it seemed like salary fluctuations were more like amenable in the corporate space because I
Totally.
think there was just like bigger ranges
Sure.
for like what HR was allowing, and then just like days off. So like for example, like at the nonprofit place I was considering, like they I don't think would go above like 2 weeks, like 14 days for like PTO. But other places you could go higher. So I'm not thinking of like a categorically like different like
Sure.
thing, but yeah, that was kind of my experience across those two
So it
areas.
sounds like maybe it's not so much that there's category differences in negotiation, but maybe there's more to be had in corporate spaces relative to nonprofit spaces in your comparison. Okay, I think that makes sense. So then, I guess kind of the other things that, I've been thinking about then is, you know, what then do kind of your work hours look like? And then how does that compare? How do you feel having spent so much time in academia? How would you compare kind of the working culture then of academia to the working culture of kind of corporate America?
Yeah. I like I feel like weird saying this, but I love working 9 to 5. I really do. I would work all sorts of hours as a grad student, and not it wasn't pushed on me at all, but it was just like
Sure.
that's what I did.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I literally don't open my laptop past 5 o'clock on Friday, and I open it the first time 9 a.m. on Monday. And at first I was like, what do I do with my time? And then I was like, wait, I can just like relax with my time, like not I can watch TV, I can like run, I don't know. And it's been so great. I love it. And I've said this before, but I just feel like by the end of grad school, I was so like my job was just so much like focused on like producing all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and it just like thinking about like my area of like my area of expertise just became kind of like formulaic, like oh, when I'm writing a paper, these are all the things I have to hit in the intro and whatever. And so I stopped even like reading relevant materials because I just like it was just kind of a formula of how to write a paper anymore. I knew what to cite and like all that kind of stuff. And so I was like, I don't have time to like expand my knowledge base right now. I have to focus on producing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but now I read again for pleasure. Like, I don't know. I'm gonna like, I don't know, have a moment of admiring other people and being degradatory to myself. But like other people read like 50 books a year. And I'm like, how do you read a book a year? Like, I don't know. I don't read that much. And so now I like read books again for like pleasure, and it's like kind of nice. So yeah, I just feel like I can re-engage with like the topics that really interested me in the first place. And I also get to like volunteer in the community again, which was really important to me,
Sure.
as like why I got involved in the space in the first place. And like now I can actually do some of like the on the ground justice work that I wanted to do in grad school, but I just didn't have time to. And so I'm able to kind of re-engage in a lot of my interests.
That's awesome. Also feel similarly about reading books. I stopped reading a lot in grad school, and I feel like I've now been able to not only purchase books, but also read those books. So it's not just a stack on the desk, it's a stack that I actually
Right,
get to engage with, as opposed to
right,
looking like one day in the distant future, I will open this book. So I
right.
certainly appreciate that. I don't think that's derogatory to yourself. I also feel that way when people are like, I'm reading so much. Um, so, I know that we're kind of coming close to time. So I think the one last question that I really have for you is that one of the things that Kate and I talk a lot about in this series is the concept that taking an industry position, whether that's in a nonprofit space like I'm at a government space like where Kate's at, or in a corporate space like where you are, that it is somehow perceived as less than in some cases, not in all departments, not by all faculty, but that there is a somewhat general sense that moving into these spaces is less than, or it's less prestigious, in part because it doesn't feed into kind of the US News and World Report rankings of students because we're not placing them in R1 positions. And that
Mhm.
because of that, students are making decisions based upon this concept that going into these spaces makes you less than a scholar, or the research is less rigorous. And I know that you've had a really, really good graduate experience, so this might feel distinctly different than some of Kate and I's experiences. But can you talk us through kind of what, when you hear something like that, kind of what is your take on that? Kind of what would you say to students who are experiencing that narrative from their departments? And what might you even say to faculty that are producing those kind of narratives?
Yeah, I mean, those narratives exist like completely, you know, and, you know, as a personal example, like when I started to tell people that I was, leaving, I even hate the term like leaving academia. Like, where are you going? Like, it's like, I mean, you still know the same people. Like, whatever. But I was like telling, one of my colleagues that I, took a position elsewhere, and they're like, "Oh, but you were so successful as a grad student." And I was like, "You're missing the point of like, I'm making a decision for myself, you know?"
Mhm.
And so I think that like those narratives exist, but I think that the research is not less rigorous, in corporate spaces, AltAc spaces. I think that, you can transfer your skill set. And if there is a certain place that has research that isn't up to your standards, I think my experience is that people will listen to you. Like, they'll be really amenable to you, like offering your feedback on how to improve, or, whatever. And so I think that like, there's like this false like dichotomy of like, oh, like here's how you actually do research, and here's how you like, it's like a sellout research position. I don't know. I just think that there's like a lot of things that academia can learn from how things are done in industry in terms of like improving efficiency and like stuff like that. And so I think that like there's like this separation in people's minds of like, you can't, you know, cross pollinate like areas, but I think that's totally false. Like,
Mhm.
I think that, for example, like, like I said, that I think that, academia can be informed by industry, but I think that the reverse is true as well. Like, the concept of like formal pre-registrations didn't exist at Walgreens before me, but now we do formal pre-registrations
Mhm.
because, of reasons that I don't have to go into, but
Sure.
like that's something that academics care about, and now I brought that over here, and I think it's going to improve the way we do stuff. And so I think that there's like this bi-directional collaboration that, or cross-sharing that can happen. And so I think these narratives like don't have to exist. So for students, I would say like, first of all, like, do what you want to do, because your PI is not you, and you're not going to live your life, so like you make your own decisions.
Sure.
um, and then to faculty, it's like, I just think that, they have to realize that, their students are not a carbon copy of what works for them. Um, and in reality, there's just not enough positions that are available for everyone. And that's a problem that academia has to grapple with. It's not going to be fixed in the next 6 months or a year, 5 years. So, the reality is that a lot of your trainees are going to be going on to positions that are not traditional R1 jobs. And so you have to be amenable to preparing your students for those things, and having explicit conversations about that is needed, and I don't think my department, for example, did a great job of advertising that fact that most of us are not going to go on into academic positions. And so when I did turn to start looking for these types of jobs, I had no idea what types of jobs were even there in the first place.
Mhm.
And everyone I talked to is kind of in the same boat. The user experience, is that the only thing? I'm like, no, there's so much more. Not to knock user experience, right? And
Sure.
so I think that there has to be this greater explicit, knowledge building throughout your graduate career.
Totally. I super appreciate that. I appreciate, the conversation of that there's this false dichotomy, right? That, you're over here, we're over here, that there's no learning to be had. I think that's really thoughtful and insightful. I think you're right. I mean, I think about at my job, we do a lot of a lot of technical assistance work. And one of the things that I said on like day 2 of my job, I said, why is there not a researcher in the room taking field notes? There's so much institutional knowledge happening in these technical assistance meetings where people are making decisions out loud. They're processing past decisions out loud. These are things that would benefit the field and replication as we do this. Why is there not a researcher in the room can treat these technical assistance meetings or these facilitation meetings, these policy meetings as data collection meetings? And now at my job, almost every TA meeting that has a long-term kind of longitudinal look and approach to the TA work that we do always has a researcher in the room for that exact reason. So yeah. I think you're exactly right that, and honestly, when I came into my job, they said, well, we've only ever really done TA work. We haven't really had a lot of researchers in the room. And they were super amenable to it, right? It wasn't like I don't know, let's see if it works. It was like, okay, let's try it. Let's do it.
Right.
We're already going to be there anyway. I might as well pull up the computer and take some notes while I'm in here. Totally. And so I think you're right. I think that both spaces can learn from one another, and there's space to bring our training over here, and certainly space for academia to think differently about who we're writing to, what our audiences look like, how do we diversify dissemination, particularly if we're interested in getting it to folks that through paywalls or even folks that, don't necessarily understand dense academic writing. So right. I think there's certainly some bi-directional space to be had. With that, I want to give space for folks that are in the audience. If you had any questions, I know we were able to touch on Josh's question. Sierra, do you feel like we've answered your kind of question about what industry can teach academia and vice versa, or do you feel like there's kind of more to unpack there? There's more to unpack. Do you want to ask a little bit more about, do you have any more specific questions, Sierra, about that concept of there being kind of this bi-directional learning? And also feel free to take yourself off mute if that would be helpful too.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, for sure.
Yes. I think I heard you mention kind of like differences in efficiency. Mm-hmm. And not just to focus on that, but that's something I'm always wondering about because I'm a GRA, and I'm split between a bunch of different grants, and some of them, because they're working with, I guess what would be non-academic for what they're producing their outcomes for, it's a lot faster. And then some of them, it's like completely different. And so like the speeds of everything just like has me kind of everywhere. And so if you can give me a little bit more, like kind of explain more about like the differences in efficiency and probably timelines and like how things are packaged. I don't know if all of those things play together between academia and industry, and how maybe they can inform each other.
I don't have any like specific, I don't think, like, because academia, and this is like, it's just like how it's set up, like, mm-hmm. Like the way of like slow dissemination and stuff like that. Like, it's easy for me to say, oh, like, let's like not, take 6 months in peer review and then another, 4 months and then another, 4 months after, revision 3. Like, that's easy to say, right? But like in practice, I don't know how like that would be done in academia. But I think the general concept, right, that like we don't need to be doing all of that. Like, there should be more transparent and more accessible ways to access research, especially for things that do have translational implications. We can write all we want about the translational implications, but then it's behind a paywall. Like, what is that, I think also just like training academics to be more, I don't know, just like have better science communication skills. I think that a lot of what I have learned in my job is that I thought that I did a good job at like talking about my research in academia, and to be able to kind of reframe to meet whoever I'm talking to, what their interests were. But it turns out that I am still working on that skill very much so, in terms of translating my findings into a very simple way that somebody who might not know or care about the research, that they understand. And so I think that, one maybe more actionable recommendation would be to not only increase like the rapidity in which research is, disseminated, and the transparency in which it, is happening, but for us to be trained more to communicate what we're finding, right? In industry, I'm talking to people who belong to different, groups of the organization. They each have their different understandings of what research is and their own interests. And so talking to them in a way that is understandable, I have to think about how to do that. And so I think that, one thing like that can be really transferred to academia. Conversely, the opposite way, I'm not working in one of the most statsy or data intensive areas of the UCAN in industry. I'm not on the data science team, for example. So bringing in concepts to my team, like power analyses, were not that was not heard of on my team really. But guess what? Now we do power analyses before we do research, and they were like, can you do this? And I'm like, yes, I can do this. And they're like, great, why wouldn't we do this if we can? And I'm like, cool. So now, we do sensitivity analyses and some things. We do, all just different types of things that I've learned in grad school that I do think make science better. And, you can be more confident in your results and all stuff like that. And how we do it. And so I think that there is just a lot of space for us to transfuse our knowledge, as long as you can do it yourself. I think that you can definitely bring that into your industry positions. So hopefully that can illuminate a little bit more, Sierra, on some things that I'm thinking about.
Yes, thank you.
One of the other thing that comes up as you were talking, James, is, you were talking about how Walgreens will almost sub out some of the actual data collection work. That can happen in academia, right? We think that we need to hire lots of grad students to do that work. And I'm not suggesting as a way to get rid of grad students. That's not the goal here. But, even at JSP, we partner with NORC out of Chicago to do some of our survey research, just because they have more staff, they can touch more people to get the survey out, that we can subcontract in the grant that we are offering that, and still use the same grad students to take in the information that NORC is sending us, to work with NORC to say this is what the survey needs to look like, and then just have NORC do the work itself. So I think that there are, and in that way, we've effectively created more elbow room for ourselves, but also created space where we are not taking we're not taking full 2 years to collect surveys because I'm trying to retweet the survey. I have a large survey corporation that's their entire role, is to disseminate surveys in efficient ways. So I think thinking about in academia, thinking about ways in which you can actually use some of these for-profit firms as subs in your grants might also be a way that academia could learn from industry as well.
Right. And I think people are oftentimes like, oh, that's not even possible because the cost is going to be so crazy. But I mean, the cost is not always actually that crazy for these types of places. And so I think it's actually a thing you could really do in academia. So I was actually talking to a friend recently who's a graduate student, and she actually did that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so cool that you're using one of these these companies. So it could be done.
I think so too. I think that's certainly a way to kind of expedite the space. And I definitely think, I will not get on my soapbox today about data communication, but I think you're absolutely right. I think, for grad students who are looking into industry spaces, being somebody who knows how to communicate to wide varieties of audiences, some of whom have science backgrounds, some of whom are community members, your ability to move back and forth between those is so prioritized, I feel like, or at least in my experience, that working through that in grad school is super helpful. I think learning how to translate to community members what we're saying, and knowing that in a single meeting, You might have, for me, I had a meeting the other day where I was presenting data. I had chiefs of police, I had victims advocates in the room, I had a judge in the room, I had researchers in the room, and being able to play to all of those audiences, I think is really, really important. So certainly practicing those skills. And I think, Cyril,
Totally.
there's something else that you said that I think is really thoughtful that I think James mentioned earlier too, was that in academe, depending on how your department is structured or your PI, that you might be assigned to one singular project and then you stay on that one singular project for quite some time. Where in industry spaces, you are working on 4 or 5 or 6 projects at any one time. Does that feel about right, James? I think you said that you have multiple projects going on at any one time.
Yeah.
And getting that practice in earlier too, I think is also helpful. And also part of the, expediency or kind of idea of fostering efficiency in academe is that if you're constantly working multiple projects, right, you have a project that's in development, you have a project that's in data collection, you have a project that's in analysis, project that's in writing, and you kind of think of those categories as how you're working different projects. I think you also find that you'll move to industry and have an easier time transitioning. Does that feel about right in your experience?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, you're working on a lot of different projects, much more than in grad school, hopefully. um, and just to add on, like you're not always like the lead on projects. Like you might be a consultant on a project in which you're taking a more backseat role, but you're still like involved in it too. And so I guess like the demands of like task switching are greater, I feel like, and also just like the true like amount of true collaboration that I feel like is happening is much greater, as opposed to like in academia where it was like me and my PI working just together. Now in a meeting there's literally 25 people who all have different asks, and you have to kind of meet everyone where they are to some capacity, right? And so all of that is happening, and like those skills can be built up.
Totally. I really appreciate that. I think I think I want to use that language. There's a greater attention to task switching. I think that definitely feels right. I see Kate kind of like giggling over there. I feel like that feels great. Are there any other questions? I know we have like 3 more minutes here, but any other questions from folks you want to squeeze in? Feel free to unmute yourself or chat it. I'm hearing none. I think I'm seeing none in this right time. But James, thanks so much. I feel like I also learned a lot about corporate space and corporate research that I didn't quite understand. Kate, I don't know if that was your feeling too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, quite a few parallels between my work with government agency, with the Department of Corrections. But it was really fascinating to hear some of not only your path, which alone is fascinating in your research area, but just kind of those similarities and those kind of similar experiences.
Yeah, totally. Well, I'm happy to connect with anyone who has any additional follow-up questions offline, but yeah, really happy to be here, and it was great to chat with everyone.
Thank you so much. So for folks in the audience, and then for you, James, we will post the recording on the ASC DCS website. So you'll have access to the recording. There'll also be access to James's biography, his contact information, the questions that we ask him. So that will all be there for folks as a repository, as well as the repository for other rock stars that we have featured. But you are their first corporate researcher. I feel like that feels right, doesn't it, Kate?
Yeah. For-profit think tank with Zach, but I think the first, corporate.
Yeah, for sure. Which feels, I think the corporate world feels just slightly different than the for-profit consulting firms. So we had someone from one of the big 4 come in to talk about what research looks like there. Similar process, but certainly a little bit different about thinking about research being in-house, almost like you're running your own shop in-house, which is super cool. Well, thanks so much, James. I so appreciate you joining us. I know Kate really appreciates you joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.
Great. Well, have a good rest of your day, okay?
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.